To speak of esoteric psychology is to speak of something unimaginable, non-verbalizable, and ultimately unbearable. By this, I mean it forces us to confront the fact that our psychological structure is infinitely richer, more complex, and fundamentally different from what we believe it to be today. This does not mean our current beliefs are entirely false. Rather, they are contained within a much broader process, a process that, in our ordinary state of psychological organization, we have no way of translating or clearly understanding. To use a metaphor, and we must rely on metaphors to find our way here, we must understand that the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the butterfly are the same being in different states. Consider this. We only know they are the same being through scientific knowledge, because from a common verbal perspective, our words tell us they are three distinct entities. When we speak of entering esoteric psychology, we are in a sense engaging in a dialogue between caterpillars or chrysalises discussing their destiny to become butterflies. Yet the butterfly is immeasurable, utterly beyond the grasp of the caterpillar or chrysalis state. It is immeasurable because in our habitual state of perception, we require precise forms to process information. We need images. We need to imagine. But what we are discussing here is unimaginable. We need to verbalize, which is simply another way of giving form. We need language to understand one another. Yet language is organized in a way that is inconsistent with the vaster stages lying within the potential structure of our psyche. It is unbearable because the habitual structure of our psyche, centered on the ego, is deeply socially conditioned. This conditioning excludes the possibility that other levels of consciousness exist within the human being. For us to truly grasp what we are referring to, in a profound sense, our previous perception must be disorganized. It must be questioned. In other words, everything esoteric disorganizes the current state of our psyche, and that is precisely why it is called esoteric. In this sense, it is dangerous to the psyche's current state because the ego requires forms to understand. It even needs forms to become interested in a subject. It needs to turn the information into an object of desire. The current state of our psyche requires this information to be convertible into desire, to be longed for. For us, when something becomes an object of desire, it means it can be captured. It means we can possess it. This natural movement of the desire to possess what we call esoteric information automatically makes that information toxic to the ego. It is not toxic in itself, but rather becomes so because of the spontaneous movement of appropriation that is triggered within us. The psychic need for form. The desire for appropriation reinforces certain psychological processes that produce an inflation of the ego. The ego translates information from another dimension into its own terms, and in doing so, it risks its own disorganization. This is the essential difficulty of this subject. A conscious, or often unconscious, interest in these topics is often an egoic interest, a wish to know more, to gather more data, and to place oneself on some sort of evolutionary scale of cosmic dynamics. This automatically closes the door to true understanding and destabilizes our habitual psychic state. Therefore, one must be very careful, very vigilant when approaching these themes. Our primary vigilance must be to recognize our own need to turn what we are discussing into a form, that is, something that can be understood, clearly imagined, and made desirable or exciting. This is the movement of the ego. This movement is inevitable, and that is why we must watch it closely. We must be clear when the appetite to close or finalize information becomes excessive, toxicity and danger arise. If this information is true, it is vibratory. It carries a vibration, and that is what matters. The longing to give it an excessively precise form lowers its vibration, it lowers its dimension. While it may satisfy and calm the psychological craving for clear objects and shapes, the essential quality of that vibration is lost. In this regard, I believe one of the most important things to remember when reading esoteric texts is that all verbalization implies a drop in dimension. Something that exists in a vaster dimension is reduced or translated into a lesser one, and there is an art to lowering dimensions. Drawing is a perfect example. When we draw, we do so in two dimensions. If an artist knows how to draw correctly, they know how to produce a three-dimensional effect, and to produce that effect, they must renounce certain lines. If I draw a house but do not yet understand perspective, I might try to draw every single line I imagine the house has, but the drawing will be wrong. To draw the house correctly, I must present it so that the windows, walls, and objects on the other side are not drawn. This may seem trivial, but it is not. When there is a change in dimension, a descent in dimension, there must be an austerity of lines. There must be an austerity in the process. One must renounce the longing to include everything one believes should be included. Something must remain open, and by remaining open, an effect is produced. Explanations in esoteric terms are valuable for their effect, not for their concrete reality. The effect creates a vibration with which we resonate, allowing a more intuitive level of ourselves to capture a totality that is not fully represented on the verbal plane or in images. In its current state, our psyche requires a center. It is organized around a center. It needs stability in a story. Our entire psychic process presupposes the feeling of a personal history, the sensation of a center to which all experience is referred, a permanence that allows us to recognize these processes as belonging to that center. In other words, they belong to me, and I am the center. Entity and state. Our psyche has a fundamental need for identity. Identity implies tethering something dynamic and ever-changing to something constant, something that can stabilize the fluid nature of our perception. Consequently, our psyche operates in terms of identity and entity. We conceive of reality as a collection of entities. It is deeply abstract for us to accept reality as a complex symphony of different states of being. A state is one thing, an entity is quite another. An entity is a thing. It has clear, defined boundaries. A state of being, however, is a peculiar level of the functioning of being itself. This may seem abstract, but it is fundamental. There is a distinction between entities and being. To understand the difficulty here, we must remember that Western philosophy took 2,000 years to recognize this difference, that the entity is not the being. Aside from a few Greek philosophers, it took 2 millennia to register this distinction. It is one thing to look at entities, and quite another to perceive that which gives those entities their very existence. I say this so we may grasp the true scale of the difficulty in what we are exploring today. The psyche needs to identify, and in more concrete terms, this means to personalize. We grant these states of being the configuration of entities, of persons, gods, or beings, created in the image and likeness of what we believe ourselves to be. Human beings believe themselves to be a person, an entity, rather than a state of being. Consequently, our psyche configures every vibrational perception of these states into the form of an entity. This is the origin of gods. These are the images automatically produced by the psyche when it captures other states of reality. The psyche acts as a translator, lowering the dimension of a vibration until it becomes a form. When we need to transition from vibration to form, the process occurs spontaneously within the brain. Vibration produces form. Our skill, or our vigilance, does not lie in stopping the production of forms, but in being able to notice them, to decipher the forms that are spontaneously generated, no matter how sublime they may seem, and ultimately to go beyond them. Of course, every time we attempt to discard these forms, the psyche, which is itself organized through form, no longer feels secure. It becomes unsettled. It feels as if something is missing. This is why the organism as a whole struggles to endure the formless quality, to remain in contact with amorphous levels of reality without personalizing or imagining them. An image is a contour drawn from memory. Every vibrational process spontaneously produces a perception that triggers a certain level of memory, which then shapes that vibration into images. A clear example of this involves two people with subtle perception, one conditioned as a Christian, the other as a Buddhist. Suppose both enter a state of perception that allows them to register the loving reality of being. In one brain, this will appear in the form of a stout, jovial figure. In the other, as a tall, blond man with flowing hair, resembling a modern athlete more than a Sephardic Jew from the first century. I say this because Christ often appears in the consciousness of mystics looking like a modern archetype of beauty, which is historically impossible. It is an image produced by the brain, arising from conditioning, from a habit of associating a loving vibration with a specific aesthetic. We have become accustomed to this association through centuries of reinforcement. This accumulation in the brain causes any capture of a vibration identifiable as love to automatically trigger this specific image. This image is a conditioning. It is clearly not the reality itself. It is a low-dimensional operator that takes a vibration and grants it a recognizable shape for the conditioned consciousness. We are going to develop a very broad perspective which, at first, must necessarily be abstract. We will gradually descend toward greater concretions, approaching levels with which we can identify. In fact, any conversation regarding esoteric themes is not merely an explanation, but a form of training. At this level, explanations are simply modes of practice. From an esoteric perspective, psychology is not human-centered. It implies understanding the human being, and consequently, the human psyche, as an emergent process within a cosmic process. Within this, there lies a potential for the flowering of psychological structures which metaphorically open like the petals of a flower in harmony with the cosmos. This flowering cannot occur independently of the cosmic process. Human psychology is part of a much vaster psyche, of which we are but one aspect. Therefore, to speak of esoteric psychology is to speak of something that is, for the human being, absolutely decentered. The universe as vibration. When we speak of the esoteric, we must try to represent the universe as a vibrational system. The esoteric perception of what appears to us as material is that it is actually a complex web of vibrations. The universe reveals itself as a process of vibrational interference, a complex interaction of different vibrations, each with distinct qualities, interrelating with one another. In physical terms, this produces interference. This interference is creative. It produces resonances and new vibrations, thereby generating new realities. In other courses, I usually try to address you based on what you can perceive for yourselves in the moment. When we speak of astrology, for instance, I try to avoid external hypotheses. However, we cannot do that with today's subject. You must accept, at least as a hypothesis, the frameworks and sketches I will draw to guide our perception. These vibrations can be synthesized into 7 qualities manifesting at 7 different speeds. These 7 speeds are what we call planes, 7 different vibrational planes. And within each of those 7 planes, 7 distinct vibrations operate. This interference is a phenomenon in which the 7 vibrations manifest as 7 planes and simultaneously express themselves as 7 qualities. Vibration at a low speed is what we call matter, and vibration at a high speed is what we call vibration, or traditionally, spirit. These 7 vibrational planes are in turn constantly traversed by an interplay of these same 7 high-speed vibrations. As they penetrate the various planes, They interact with each other and with the specific speeds of each plane. Humanity has imagined this in many ways, as a cosmic game, as an act of love, as a lesson in creativity, as a musical explosion generating universes, or even as a war between wills or armies. From a certain point of view, the universe appears to us as a relational learning process between these 7 qualities, learning to interact and generate new realities together. From this perspective, we could say the universe is a group creation. When I say group, please do not over-identify with the word. Metaphorically, in Hindu traditions, these 7 vibrations are 7 brothers or sisters interacting in an infinite cosmic play. These 7 vibrations, from a more synthetic view, can be reduced to 3 major vibrations. The third of these opens up to give rise to a fourth, which then unfolds into 3 more. This is a profound logic of the vibrational realm. There are always 2 great poles and an oscillating intermediary pole that links them. Try to imagine this as 7 currents of light of different colors, continuously interacting at varying degrees of intensity. This interactive play is the universe. Let us imagine this dance of waves of which we are a part. And let us imagine at the same time the densest emergent results, the galaxies, the stars, the planets. Within this dense emergence is a planet where a process is unfolding, and that is where we are. I say this to provide context. From an esoteric standpoint, this is a global process. The psychic process manifesting on Earth is but one aspect of this vastness, a material vastness framed, in turn, by vastly more global vibrational levels. Now, leaning on the material plane, we can say that matter itself possesses an incessant activity. It possesses an intrinsic intelligence. This intelligence is a combinatory capacity, immanent logics of combination. I am referring, for example, to the valency of chemical elements, the existence of patterns of relationality within matter that allow each element to recognize other structures and establish combinations with them. We see this again on another plane with the genetic code, a complex pattern through which the elements of what we call organic recognize each other, create new combinations, grow, multiply, and generate variations, all arising from the inherent intelligence of matter itself, the intelligence of matter. This intelligence, inherent to matter in its infinite combinations, has played out over billions of years. As these immanent codes have combined and recombined, they have moved toward a greater sensitivity, generating organisms capable of responding to, recognizing, and linking themselves more intensely with other organisms in subtler vibrations. The evolutionary direction of this material intelligence brings forth an ever-increasing sensitivity, one capable of registering and responding to progressively subtler levels of vibration. The material plane itself develops a capacity to respond to these vibrations. Consequently, these vibrations penetrate more deeply into this material intelligence, giving rise to entirely new processes. To help you visualize this with the right elements, let us look at how terrestrial matter evolves toward the creation of elements like chlorophyll. Chlorophyll has the capacity to fix solar energy. That is, it attracts a vibration, a quality far removed from the natural process of planet Earth, fixes it, and allows it to penetrate terrestrial matter. This modifies and gives rise to new processes that would be impossible without the presence of solar energy fixed within the Earth's substance. I want to show you how, on the material plane, chlorophyll and the plant kingdom as a whole represent the emergence of a sensitivity on Earth that allows the planet to link itself much more closely with the energetic and vibratory currents of the solar system. This allows for new levels, new entities, and new organisms to be generated on Earth. Terrestrial matter is altered through this interaction, making possible complex organisms like our own, organisms that, millions of years later, create objects like satellites to traverse the solar system. The evolutionary process moves toward generating antennas capable of opening up to levels far broader than those in which they originally developed. This sensitivity, this expansion of the capacity to respond, is what we call consciousness. Levels of matter that are capable of reflecting and self-reflecting a much vaster process. Consciousness. We must distinguish between the levels of consciousness determined by material activity and other possible levels of consciousness. Levels of sensitivity that are not determined by material activity, but are independent of it. In principle, material activity is an incessant interaction of high repetition patterns. To use an analogy, it is like an intelligent software that learns to develop new combinations and new algorithms, yet remains repetitive, developing from the past toward the future. In contrast, when we speak of consciousness not determined by the material, we are talking about a level of sensitivity capable of registering, interacting, and resonating with what we have called high-speed vibrations. Consequently, these high-speed vibrations do not respond to repetitive patterns, and they do not move from the past toward the future. There is consciousness determined by material activity and consciousness not determined by material activity. To use a word that might allow us to configure this differently, consciousness not determined by material activity is related to what we call love. This is love in the sense of a capacity to perceive and include realities that lie far beyond the needs of the particular organism resonating with them. These states of consciousness are capable of resonating with broader levels of reality whose activity does not respond directly to the immediate needs of the organism registering them. What we are calling love here has nothing to do with emotion or sentiment. Instead, it has to do with inclusivity, a state of openness and the capacity of the organism to remain open to that which lies beyond itself. Question: would the psyche fall within the experience determined by material activity? Carutti: the hallmark of esoteric psychology is the conceptualization of the multidimensionality of the psyche. The level of the psyche we usually refer to is determined by the activity of matter. However, within the petals of the psyche's flower, there exists a potential for an opening related to a consciousness totally independent of survival. This is a discontinuous consciousness, in the sense that it does not attempt to continue. Observe, for example, the activity of thought. It is an activity that constantly tries to continue, to never cease. And I return to the metaphor of music, processes that appear and disappear without any control over their appearance or disappearance. Death is intrinsic to them. Question: what would be an example of a living organism not determined by material activity, one that does not seek to perpetuate itself? Carutti: as I said before, the difficulty of this subject is that the habitual psyche tries to turn what it hears into a form, into something permanent. In your question, I hear the request for an example of a permanent state of that consciousness. Let us put it this way: that consciousness is a state of functioning in the organism where there is no activity tending toward perpetuation. For instance, the activity of brain cells is continuously perpetuating thought. They cannot stop thinking because they cannot tolerate their activity ceasing. What we call love is an activity of spontaneity where there is no need to continue. It is something that opens within an organism that has reached a certain level of integration. To put it more richly, this discontinuous activity exists in the depths of our being, but it is buried by the sheer amount of energy consumed by continuous activity. Question: I was looking for an example in a concrete form, but I see that is incorrect. I have to settle for the musical notes. Laughter. Carutti: as we said at the beginning, when we refer to all of this, something in us tries to catch it and close it off. something that wants to turn it into a complete form. The art lies precisely in the tolerance of not drawing the complete form. Musical notes are a living organism. To say that musical notes are a living organism is a metaphor in the sense that we are speaking of a vibrational state. It is interesting to perceive the need manifesting among us right now, the need to identify. I do not say this as a criticism, but rather to illustrate the activity of a consciousness bound to the material process. This consciousness is highly active. It becomes excited when encountering other vibrations and immediately seeks to close them, that is, to give them form. What we can do is notice this excitement, observe this attempt to close the circle, and see if the organism can learn to tolerate the non-closure. Viktor Frankl, a psychologist who lived in concentration camps, once remarked, "The best of us died quickly because they were attentive to the needs of others rather than their own, whereas the most selfish of us survived." Perhaps this serves as an example, but I would seek to erase any moral connotations here. In everything we are investigating, it is important to consider the principle of rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. There must be a profound sensitivity toward the necessary interaction of different levels. At certain levels, that which we call selfishness, or to use a scientific word that might be unsettling, autopoiesis, is essential. Continuity is essential. We are speaking precisely about certain levels, about certain organisms, and we are potentially such organisms that develop a sensitivity capable of registering levels without autopoiesis. We are capable of registering levels that have no continuity and consequently of altering our behavior based on that perception. It is like changing the instrument. It is a much finer instrument, one that has developed a greater sensitivity, and perhaps, following Frankl's example, that is why it broke. Well, it broke from one point of view, but it could also be said that it produced a completely different effect. Properties of intelligent activity. Still within this evolutionary terrain, I wanted to show you how life, in what we call evolution, a word we should place in quotes so as not to cling to it too tightly, is shaped by material intelligence. This activity is made of units possessing an immanent logic of relationship. They know how to relate to one another. They respond to specific patterns regarding how they will link with other units. Think of the genetic code. It is an immanent logic of relationships. Chemical compounds are exactly this. Even the most material activity of matter, the interplay of valences, consists ultimately of relational patterns. It is a fundamental characteristic of the evolution of matter that these elementary units, which are immanent logical structures, generate emergent properties through the unfolding of their relationships. They create states of being or activity that go beyond themselves. Units, logic, emergent properties. The internal logic of hydrogen and oxygen atoms generates water. It generates something else entirely. Progressively, these units learn to associate, and through this association, they develop more complex organisms. For example, an association of proteins and other basic chemical elements within a certain liquid bubble millions of years ago initiated what gave rise to life, the first cells. The first living units were bacteria. When bacteria associated with other elements, they gave rise to cells. Cells possess mitochondria, which are actually bacteria included within them. In this progressive associative learning, cells would later generate multicellular organisms. These generate tissues, which lead first to simple organisms and then to the most complex ones. I want you to see this constant dynamic. There is an elementary unit moving with a certain code, developing certain properties and states. The next step is that some of these level 1 units learn to associate with each other to form a more complex organization, constituting new units at level 2. In other words, these units renounce their autonomy, their previous level of existence, and come to form a colony that gives rise to a new level of organization. This process repeats itself with ever-increasing complexity. Question: were the possibilities of combination already given within the first unit? Carutti: we can say there is a matrix of unfolding, a potential for various paths that can be taken. For example, one path leads to dinosaurs, another leads to humans. The mystery is that these matrices of combination exist, what we refer to as the intelligence of matter, and they carry out this process, which science views through the lenses of mutation and natural selection. The important thing to see is that the dynamic of the evolutionary process, from this perspective, is the generation of units that learn to associate and create a collective organism that did not exist before. This collective organism then becomes a distinct unit itself. In this evolutionary process of units and associations, the unfolding of immanent matrices is not enough. Cyclically, generating great evolutionary leaps, these units develop emergent properties through which they capture energy from another level. For instance, bacteria managed to fix nitrogen. This produced a process in matter, and the nitrogen fixed by bacteria allowed for the appearance of the entire plant kingdom. Without bacteria, nitrogen could not be captured, and the plant kingdom would not exist. The plant kingdom, in turn, develops a property already present in bacteria, but in a much more complex and powerful form: photosynthesis. Consequently, they capture solar energy, drawing vastly more energy to Earth and allowing for a multitude of living beings to exist. Crucial to this process is the emergence of these qualities that allow a lower level to capture a quality belonging to a larger inclusive system, drawing it in and allowing it to penetrate the smaller system. We can see then that it is inherent to this process for qualities to emerge that allow smaller systems to enter into resonance with larger or more inclusive ones. And now we can make the analogy with ourselves. Esoterically, the human psychic process can be conceived as the incessant activity of the material intelligence inherent to the human organism. This intelligence is constantly testing and rehearsing new interactions. On one hand, these lead to increasingly complex social forms. On the other, they lead to individual organisms with the capacity to capture other levels of reality and attract that energy. At the same time, it is implicit in what I am saying that human units are destined to coordinate with one another at a much more complex level of association than we have today, not as mere organizations or institutions, but as organisms. This means generating interactive networks that enable emergent properties at a level beyond what we currently know as human. I want you to see the analogy. There is a double process here. Units learn to associate, renouncing a degree of individuality to generate new units, which in turn learn to associate and generate further units. In the midst of this process, so that it may continue, properties are generated that are capable of capturing higher vibrations that enrich the system. The system cannot continue on its own without including what lies beyond it. Or, put another way, that which lies beyond, based on the level of penetration already achieved, waits until a new sensitivity or capacity for resonance is produced in order to penetrate more deeply and create new possibilities within the smaller system. Evolution, initiation, and domestication. In this sense, love is an emergent property. It is an inevitable destiny for planet Earth, just as photosynthesis once was. We do not know how many turns and cycles the system must travel before enough sensitivity emerges to capture the energy of love, introduce it to the Earth, and make it circulate. But it is part of the logic of evolutionary unfolding that sooner or later, there will emerge an abundance of human organisms capable of capturing and resonating with, attracting and fixing energy from other levels. It is as much a part of the logic of unfolding as a child passing from the oral stage to the anal from the anal to the phallic, and from the phallic to the genital. These are phases, esoteric evolutionary psychology. This is not yet clearly recognizable, but the totality of human activity responds to this pattern. Implicit in esoteric psychology is the potential emergence of new stages, stages we do not yet recognize as necessary phases of the Earth's unfolding. On one hand, the human being responds to this evolution, an evolution that, through the play of these internal matrices, continues to test and rehearse. It does so with a certain destiny because this is a destiny of the Earth itself. The plant kingdom was a possible destiny for terrestrial evolution. It was simply a matter of waiting through enough cycles for it to occur. In this sense, this progressive sensitization is part of the evolutionary process. It is a matter of waiting for enough cycles for general conditions to trigger this latent possibility. Now, from an esoteric point of view, this terrestrial process is complemented by another process: initiation. Initiation. Initiation is a complex word. It tells us that, cyclically, certain human units emerge with a level of integration capable of attracting subtler levels of vibration, anchoring them and radiating them within the evolutionary process. These are precursor units of what will later become a global emergent property: attract, radiate, anchor. Question: does this happen within the evolutionary process, or does it open up a mutation? Carutti: the evolutionary process requires infinite cycles to manifest. It holds a potential, and it is simply a matter of waiting for a certain number of cycles to occur. By way of analogy, we can say that the process of initiation is related to mutations, to the activity of subtle vibrations that enable the acceleration of the process. They accelerate the penetration of the non-terrestrial into the evolution of terrestrial matter. In other words, human organisms emerge with a level of integration, which in the future will be common to all, or at least to a vast number of organisms, that moves the process forward. They are capable of capturing a certain mode of subtler vibration that enters the Earth, making possible new processes that would not have been generated in that cycle without that initial penetration. These organisms, on one hand, radiate vibration after becoming sensitized to it and capturing it. Consequently, that vibration can penetrate and generate new environments on Earth. On the other hand, the activity of these organisms is to present other human beings with forms charged with this subtler vibration. These forms become new symbols or models, new patterns for other human beings who are still moving within previous levels of lesser integration. The evolutionary process can be seen as the unfolding of certain patterns, patterns we call archetypes, languages, and so on, which develop according to an immanent logic of successive combinations. But cyclically, the organisms that bring in subtler vibrations generate new forms or combinations that are desired by others, thus impacting the consciousness undergoing the evolutionary process. For lack of a better word, we can call this second process domestication. When the evolutionary process is accelerated by initiation, it produces something akin to domestication. Through an imitative quality, new learned behaviors are manifested or incorporated through contact with the carriers of these subtle vibrations, though these vibrations are stepped down so they can be metabolized by organisms of lesser integration. Thus, these models and behaviors become new patterns that do not emerge from mere material logic, but stem from the stimulus provoked by another dimension. The analogy for this in the animal kingdom is the transition from wolf to dog. This passage from the wild to the domestic occurs by being at the side of man. Given certain initial conditions inherent to the intelligence of wolves by remaining alongside humans for centuries, the animal is trained, but it also shares in the human vibration. It lives within it. And so the wolf changes and becomes a dog. Later, with genetic selection and by sharing more and more of the human vibration, we all realize that in the last 50 years, dogs have changed remarkably. They are less and less wild. They possess a more human behavior, increasingly jealous, capricious. It is as if they were acquiring emotions. By being next to humans, next to an organism that lives and vibrates in a different way, the wild organism is altered. Simultaneously, the patterns humans impose on dogs cause them not only to capture, but to imitate behaviors, adopting new ways of being that were never manifested in the wild. The evolutionary possibility of a wolf feeling like eating balanced kibble because it's better for digestion is a distant one. Laughter. The number of cycles one would have to wait for that is enormous. This is an analogy for the initiatory process. Through this interaction, the wolf dog accelerates its evolution and develops new qualities. Question: but from one point of view, couldn't it be said that something that takes a leap manages to crystallize? Carutti. That is why the third function of these initiated organisms, besides radiating and archetyping, modeling, is to destroy molds, crystallizations, and old archetypes. That is, to destroy the very things they have built. Destroying archetypes. The very thing that was useful at one stage, the same collection of patterns that served to produce a global leap at a given moment, must now be destroyed at another stage. This is because those patterns possess great inertia, they are bound to form, and therefore the material intelligence immanent to them wants to survive and thus crystallizes them. Question: should they be destroyed or disorganized? Carutti. Destroyed, in the sense that one of the vibrations that cyclically descends is the destructive vibration, the destruction of the old and of what this very process has created. Question: it is a transformation. Carutti. If you want a lighter term, it is to transform, to disintegrate, to disorganize. Question: the quality of love remains. Carutti. It is important to remember what we said before. Indifference toward appearing and disappearing is inherent to the quality of love. Of course, our archetypes of love at first do not include what we are saying. They are archetypes that will have to be disorganized in due time to make way for the presence of a real, vibrational love. Question: but that is Pluto. Carutti. If you want to give it a planetary name, it is Pluto. If you want an esoteric name, it is the first ray. But I am refraining from naming things too much. This is where what we call esoteric psychology becomes very complicated. It tells us there is a potential for evolutionary development, something encapsulated within us that opens its petals like a bud, depending on the presence of certain qualities to open, analogous to light, temperature, and nutrients in biology. Exceptional organisms. The slippery ground in esoteric psychology is that there is a potential for unfolding, something folded that can be activated. The activation of this potential, from a separative point of view, is an exceptionality, at least for a certain number of cycles. An organism emerges with a development, a level of integration, that is exceptional relative to the surrounding organisms. We do not register this exceptionality as the natural flowering of global and necessary properties, as a planetary fact. Instead, it is conceptualized as the personal achievement of some exceptional individual. Consequently, the imitative side of others tries to appropriate that exceptionality, and they begin to imagine the complexity of the cyclical flowering process as a feat. It is very difficult for our habitual psychic structure to accept that this opening of new dimensions in us is not an achievement. It does not depend on the will. It is the product of a global, interactive process manifesting in an individual organism, but ultimately it has nothing to do with individual merit. That process of creative interaction is the result of a cosmic process, the result of the interplay of different dimensions of reality manifesting in a particular organism. When entering esoteric psychology, we inevitably must refer to different human types with different levels of integration, a spectrum of human types expressing various degrees of integration of the possible qualities of a human being. This is delicate because our psyche automatically organizes this as superior or inferior, as better or worse. These are profoundly clumsy ways of organizing information. If we think of the 7 qualities learning to interact in the presence of the 7 planes, this paradigm tells us that the presence of all levels of the process is always necessary for a certain global effect to be produced. It is always a global and interactive realization, never an isolated one. Conceiving of ourselves as individual and separate beings in a community, we have a strong longing to become exceptional organisms. It is difficult for us to understand the paradigm we saw earlier, beings learning to associate and interact creatively, where what matters is enabling the emergence of global properties. This does not mean all organisms are expressing the same level of integration. What matters is that the collective of units creates an organism in which all necessary levels of integration are present to produce a certain effect. It is vital that this is understood. This is why I am taking this long detour, because otherwise it is very difficult to speak of the most essential things without triggering separative interpretations that lead us into dangerous territory. We must refer to processes of integration. Just as in a drawing, we must have the austerity not to trace every line. Here we must have the austerity to tell ourselves that we do not know how the global process is designed, nor what kind of human units are necessary to form it. As soon as we pretend to know, it is as if the brain expected the feet to be made of neurons, assuming the whole organism should become like its most evolved parts. I believe this is very important. This is why I am referring to global processes to think about the human. This is a hallmark of the esoteric. Correct perception is produced by learning to make analogies with the global. If the brain does not make an analogy with the global, it projects its own construction, determined by its longing for its own continuity. Thus, for example, it imagines this progressive integration of organisms in an evolutionary way and believes that they should all become organisms of the highest level of integration. Esta sección del seminario es fundamental, ya que Carutti establece la jerarquía de la conciencia que utilizará para el resto de la enseñanza. He mantenido el rigor científico-filosófico, traduciendo términos como recortes, como fragmentations o segments, y asegurando que la distinción entre thought, pensamiento, e intellect, intelecto, sea clara y profesional. Levels of integration. To bring our discussion down to a concrete level, let us examine 4 different levels of integration. These imply other integrations that I will not develop now, as they are too complex for this stage. They are contained in these 4 words: instinct, intellect, intuition, and inspiration. We shall refer to these 4 qualities as emergent properties of different levels of integration, of successive stages of wholeness. Instinct. What do we call instinct? We call instinct the internal programming of an organism that possesses the capacity to recognize certain patterns in the surrounding world, which in turn determine its behavior. In animal instinct, the internal presence of certain patterns allows the organism to recognize the outside and develop specific behaviors, such as building nests, mating, or fleeing from certain animals while ignoring others. It is crucial to phrase it this way. These are patterns with the capacity to recognize other patterns, structures, or gestalts that recognize one another. And through this mutual recognition, a behavior is produced. Intellect. By the word intellect, we are indicating thought. The development of thought is an evolutionary activity in the human being. It involves the capacity to internally represent the outside world, to fix it in the brain for a sufficient amount of time, and eventually to coordinate that internal representation with action. To think is to be able to represent something, to build it internally, fix that construction, sustain it through time, place it on the screen of the mind, and coordinate one's actions with that sustained representation. The first instance of this coordination is with the hand. Crafting an arrowhead reveals the ability to hold an image and move the hand while looking, not at an external model, but at a model constructed internally. Progressively, we have learned to construct with greater complexity and coordinate much richer actions. This capacity for thought is, ultimately, a cerebral activity in which patterns, languages, symbols, and logics are also activated. However, for this function to develop, we depend deeply on the organism's ability to inhibit the spontaneous actions arising from the instinctive level. There exists an activity of level 1 patterns, a first-level intelligence that responds instinctively. It instinctively fears, instinctively desires, and instinctively charges itself with emotions or pulses. For thought to develop, a new quality must emerge, but at the same time, the organism must learn to inhibit the previous quality. If the previous quality is not inhibited, the instinctive response imposes its patterns, and behavior becomes, as we say, reflexive, blind, irrational, or confused. We also know that, in general, humans tend to hypertrophy this quality of thought, and thus hypertrophy the preceding inhibition. This creates a conflict. A large part of our habitual psychic process revolves around this: the struggle to develop this thinking quality while it remains in constant conflict with the activation of instinctive patterns. But to place thinking activity in its proper context, it must understand itself as a set of constructed patterns. Therefore, it is actually a conflict between patterns of different levels that trigger different and usually contradictory behaviors. This capacity of thought to generate behaviors that we no longer call instinctive is driven, for example, by archetypes and images of the unconscious, both personal and collective. Certain images trigger specific behaviors. If those images are activated, behavior responds to them naturally. Languages are precisely this at another level. Thought is the emergence of a certain matrix containing a set of patterns that are not present in the animal. This is what language is: a matrix that allows us to mold and orient behavior, primarily social behavior, marking a limit to what is possible. We move within what language permits. We move within what socially shared images allow. That is to say, we move within the matrix of archetypes, the collection of ideas and beliefs that surface in human beings and regulate their conduct are, in a sense, productions of the second level of software, which in order to be activated must inhibit the previous one. Now, as we know, and as we will investigate more deeply, these levels inevitably mix. The distinction between our instinctive processes and so-called intellectual patterns becomes contaminated. The characteristic of the intellect, as a builder of patterns, is that it is analytical. It separates reality by constructing images or operating with symbols of low synthetic power, or rather of high power of distinction. Its constructions are inevitable segments or cutouts of the flow of existence, as are the words through which we think. To use a word is to name, to distinguish clearly that one thing is the branch and another is the tree. In the perceptual continuum of tree, the human being separates the branch from the root, the flower from the fruit, and the leaf. We decompose. In the perceptual continuum of a landscape, the human being fragments. The incessant activity of the intellect inhibits the possibility of a global perception because it imposes a habit of analytical perception. The development or overdevelopment of this quality in us corresponds to the intrinsic need of the human process to differentiate itself from nature, to establish distance and separate so as not to remain confused or merge with it. The process necessarily requires this separation, and the development of the intellect intensifies this separative activity. The intellect emerges from and builds a series of patterns and behaviors linked to this separative drive, confirming the perception of absolute difference from the outside. Furthermore, and this is perhaps most insidious, due to its analytical quality, it prevents the capture of more global patterns in reality. At the same time, it creates a boundary regarding the amount of charge an organism can tolerate circulating through the body. By separating the branch from the trunk and the leaf, the sensations provoked by perception are also compartmentalized. If you were to remove the words from perception, removing the separation, you would immediately witness a massive alteration in the flow of sensations. But because this cannot be endured, we generally return immediately to the verbal mode, which corresponds to known, manageable sensations. Now, related to the development of the intellect and thought, there occurs the evolutionary appearance of what is esoterically called the abstract mind. Abstract mind. This is the progressive capacity to recognize complex patterns, to capture the common denominators across multiple realities and experiences. However, this capture of common patterns has an analytical base. The abstract mind captures various repeating pieces of information and suddenly abstracts them, touching a global level. Question. Like the example of mathematics, Carutti. Mathematics is the realm of the abstract mind par excellence, the ability to capture the relational background of the whole of reality. Question. But the base is analytical. Carutti. As this mental level captures more global patterns, it stops being analytical and becomes a global perception of patterns. It has an analytical base, but the perception itself is global. We have mathematics as an abstraction of the concrete, such as numbers in their habitual use, and truly abstract mathematics that emerge from global patterns without an immediate concrete correlate. These mathematics allow thought to take a leap, presenting a framework of the real that is otherwise unimaginable. For example, the Riemannian spaces upon which Einstein based his theory of relativity were conceived in the abstract. They seem like useless mental games because they did not correspond to the concrete world, until a certain mental organization managed to establish the connection between the concrete and that abstraction. This allowed us to access an intelligence of the concrete that was completely new and revolutionary for the habitual states of thought, and for the emotions and libidinal impulses associated with them. Thought implies arduous evolutionary work in its capacity to inhibit the basic impulses linked to instinct. It can only occur in organisms with a certain development of the physical and emotional. If bodily and emotional pulses continually invade, thought cannot construct in a coherent way. The learning involved in these successive qualities always consists of domesticating the previous levels of sensitivity. If an emotion is too great, thought is captured by it and is constructed in a disordered manner. When thought is captured by emotion, it builds from identification, separating or uniting according to primary unconscious images. Analytical thought that captures patterns generally develops only when there is an emotional low, which is why the scientific mind is linked to this state. Obviously, the most complex development within the abstract mind, because the qualities of pattern capture must be previously developed, is the capture of psychic patterns, patterns of an existential nature. Automatically, when the organism captures existential patterns, its behaviors begin to differ from those who do not perceive them. It is less likely to remain captured in fragmentary archetypal games, and it becomes possible to comprehend the totality of a situation, reacting to it in a different way. It is evident that for the abstract mind to develop, it requires a specific development of the emotions in the body, alongside a relative capacity to inhibit excessively analytical thought. Now, between the level of the abstract mind and intuition lies the most complex leap. Intuition. Intuition is the holistic capture of patterns, non-analytical and undelayed by the need for an articulated representation, which allows for the regulation of behavior without the habitual participation of consciousness. It is the ability to capture the totality of a pattern, the totality of a situation, and move according to that non-explicit perception. The preliminary step to understanding this is to recognize that in our interactions, patterns are constantly at play. We are, for example, projecting archetypes and positioning ourselves according to constructions that Jungian psychology has analytically discovered. We learn separately that these constructions exist and that we must understand them to avoid being captured by them as unconscious shapers of behavior. So one goes to therapy, one engages in an analytical elaboration to decode the structure in which they were immersed. One needs to review the experience. Generations of therapists have investigated fragmentary human patterns until it becomes possible to activate a capture of the global structure in which we are immersed. Consequently, behavior begins to reflect that global structure. One moves at another level. One has a different conduct. At the level of the abstract mind, where the most modern psychology functions, this capture of patterns still has an analytical base. It is born from construction and reconstruction. It is a coming and going and elaboration. Through this progressive elaboration, behavior is modified, emerging from a different depth than the patterns that previously governed it. For example, in Jungian therapy, I might discover that what I believed was rational and reflective was, in reality, mechanical. I fall in love according to a certain pattern of how the feminine is inscribed in my unconscious, and this determines me. Until I realize this, I will not believe that the mechanism is instinctive, or at least conditioned, but it is. I might believe sexual desire is instinctive, but not the act of falling in love with a certain type of person. Generally, we don't believe this has anything mechanical about it. We think it is voluntary and reflective. We do not realize we are responding to a collective pattern operating in a segment of collective consciousness that interprets it as a free activity. Now, from another level of integration, I begin to notice that all of this is mechanical. And as you know, at first, this is unbearable. As we said before, the historical dimension of psychology is unbearable for the habitual psyche centered on the ego, because it implies a total disruption of the previous organization. It means realizing that what we thought was free is actually mechanical. At the level of the abstract mind, patterns are captured based on the repetition of experience. The film plays so many times that something is caught, a coherence that previously escaped us, but the viewing of the film is still analytical. I have to think to realize it. I have to do a great deal of work to elaborate the projection of the anima to realize that what I think is free is actually a mechanical collective pattern, such as the romantic attraction of a specific type. At this level, furthermore, the organism is submerged in the patterns of that particular segment. It faces two difficulties. One is capturing the mechanical patterns by which it behaves. The other is that, being determined by survival or material consciousness, it is closed off to the presence of patterns from other levels of vibration through denial. Intuition, then, is what I call the holistic capture of a pattern, a global capture that generates new behavior spontaneously without being laborious or consciously elaborated. Question: from that same segment or from another? Carutti: in principle, it is the holistic capture of the pattern of that structure. And when I say holistic, I mean it does not appear on the mental screen. You do not have to think about it. The organism does not react to the pattern. It does not react powerfully to the stimuli produced by the word. This means I have learned to inhibit the previous process. In that previous process, Certain images and words trigger behaviors and reactions. For intuition to flower, there must be a previous capture at an analytical level of how words, archetypes, and images condition behavior. A learning process so that the previous level is inhibited. That is, intuition must arrive before the analytical process reaches the level of action. Thought and its associated reactions must be delayed long enough for the global capture to inform the totality of the organism. Otherwise, the analytical process interrupts, and rational, that is, fragmentary criteria impose themselves, resulting in a different archetypal behavior. Something in the system must learn to inhibit the previous learning. The triumph of the intellect over instinct, or of the abstract mind over concrete thought, must be transcended, understanding that the previous achievement has now become a problem. Question: does accessing the intuitive level imply inhibiting the analytical process? Carutti: fundamentally, it means inhibiting the reactions linked to it. When I say inhibit, I mean delaying in order to get ahead. It allows another function to step forward and contain the reactions to images and words that develop at the previous level, preventing behaviors from being triggered. In the same way that reflective behavior inhibits or contains the reactions provoked by instinctive pulses. Paths without conflict. From this point of view, intuitive behavior is ecological. It intuitively captures directions of movement that are non-fragmentary. Behavior is no longer dominated by fragmentation. Responses are global, not partial, and this allows one to glimpse directions that are free from conflict. This process is not a matter of will. When we say life flows, it is because the intuitive level is tuned in and activated. Something has entered into sync. For something to enter into sync, the fragmentary reaction must have been delayed. If the fragmentary reaction occurs immediately, it severs that experience of synchronicity, of global congruence with what is happening. The paths without conflict become blurred, and the pathways of conflict are precipitated. This perception of non-conflict, this guidance toward conflict-free paths, is not voluntary. It does not pass through the mental screen because if it did, if we were entirely conscious of it, the screen would fragment it once again. Self-consciousness is too small. It is narrowed by the activity of identification in the unconscious response to desires for survival or self-interest. Question: would this produce a state of stillness? Carutti: yes, but we would have to look deeper to see if it is a real stillness or a form of control. If it is control, there is still interaction. At the previous level, when the will acts, it is controlling itself. What I am saying instead is that at our level, something has matured and no longer needs to be controlled. Obviously, this implies that the organism is fully open and not preoccupied with defense. This is not a moral process. In us, love is often described as a moral achievement, but this has nothing to do with morality. That is, with a set of behaviors emerging from socially desired patterns. Rather, it is a flowering of the organism. To live at a level of greater security and creativity, the organism must realize that in the previous level, the one socially agreed upon, there is no true security or creativity. It must realize that everything it has built over millennia to provide security is deeply insecure. It does not allow us to spontaneously capture the lines of balance flowing within reality. Thus, the organism remains closed, trying to protect itself, even if it claims to be open and good. Intuition flowers from the lack of protection inherent in being open. Consequently, it is a state of extreme vulnerability. We must ask ourselves, can the organism, at other levels, endure this high degree of vulnerability? It goes without saying that here, the emotional level must be in a state of deep repose, or its excitement must be delayed enough so as not to make waves. It must be calm enough so that habitual emotional reactions are not triggered. So when I say holistic capture of patterns, I am referring to a field capture, a capture of information that does not originate analytically. The lower analogy for this is what happens to a gazelle in a herd. The herd grazes by the river. A lion appears at one end of the group. The closest gazelle smells the lion, and upon smelling it, vibrates with fear. This vibration of fear moves instantaneously through the entire field of the herd. The gazelle at the opposite end, without seeing or smelling the lion, receives that information from the field. This field information is not analytical. It runs through a global field. Question: is it a resonance with the environment? Carutti: a resonance, a sensitivity to this type of vibration. In this example, it is a capacity to resonate with the emotional vibration of the herd. A herd generates vibration. A stadium generates vibration. A closed stadium generates much greater vibration because, not being open to the air, it does not circulate. Consequently, organisms more sensitive to emotion are altered. For an example, players with a strong Pisces influence. Playing in a closed stadium with the astral charge of a football match is no joke. It is different from playing in an open space. The amount of information running through the herd is overwhelming, and organisms with greater sensitivity to those levels are naturally altered. If one wants to perform a ritual where much induction is activated, it must be done in a closed place. If done outdoors, the result will be different because there is less of a field effect for the distribution of unconscious information among participants. To return, intuition is a field capture, but not at the level of the herd, not at the human-animal collective level. It is neither instinctive nor intellectual. It pierces through these and captures information from much vaster fields. Inspiration. Finally, what I call inspiration involves an even more complex process. At this stage, the organism is so open that its action responds not to a search for balance and movement, but to the subtlest vibrations and the impulses arising from them. At this inspired level, the organism does not act for its personal needs, nor even for collective needs. It responds to much more global needs, without necessarily being conscious of it. This activity of inspiration includes the activity of anchoring vibration, radiating vibration, and constructing forms from that vibration, while simultaneously destroying others with it. Question: is this the same activity as plants with the sun? Carutti: exactly. We have reached the human equivalent of the chlorophyll stage. At this level, if I know who I am, it means something is active that is preoccupied with knowing who it is. And this is incongruent. If something is worried about its identity, it cannot respond to this inspirational level. It is possible for an action to appear inspired, but inspired by what? Perhaps by some global field linked to the human. One can be an inspired politician because one is capturing the deep vibration of a national longing, acting intuitively within that field. This could be called an inspired activity in the sense that a light bulb suddenly goes off regarding political decisions, responding to something broader. However, that broader something is still determined by the longing for survival because it emerges from levels linked to matter and the collective. The most essential characteristic of what we call inspiration, in the strict sense, is that the capture of the vaster whole is completely independent of the parts longing for survival. Otherwise, love is not possible. The openness produced by love provides a potency. It drives action. The person is effective in their action, but they are responding to a level of reality that is totally indifferent to the continuity of human processes, indifferent to the continuity of personal lives, of nations, or of religions.